Welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with Dan Geherin.
Hello and welcome to Michigan Justice Chronicles with board-certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. Today's episode is the state of Michigan has revoked your driver's license. Now what? All right, so Dan, welcome back. Great to see you.
You as well, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
So one of the privileges that many of us enjoy is a driver's license. Many of us rely on a driver's license to drive to work or for work, to take care of our families, blah, blah, blah. We all know that. You're a bit of a driver's license specialist. Can you kind of talk about how people lose their licenses and how you help protect and restore their rights?
I can. And yeah, you started off the right way, right? I mean, other than, of course, our health and a roof over our heads and those basic necessities, having a license, boy, you talk about when that's pulled from you, the effect that has on people. People lose their jobs, people lose their houses, people can't take care of their kids. You see it with elderly people when they lose their privileges to drive, their worlds are literally turned upside down. So it's a privilege we all have from age 16 to 80, whatever it is. And when it's gone, man, that stings. And oftentimes an attorney like me, a licensed appeal specialist, can help. I sort of stumbled into that practice area, Kevin. 25 years ago, I had left the prosecutor's office. A buddy of mine from high school lost his privilege to drive. He asked for some help, and I didn't know what the heck that whole world was about, but I learned it. I took a million seminars. I trained. I watched other attorneys do it. And 25 years later, we've probably put 3,000 clients back on the road lawfully and legally, and we're doing an average of 2 or 3 hearings a week. To answer your question, people lose their license either through what's called a suspension or a revocation for a variety of ways. The most common by far is criminal convictions, more specifically drunk driving or substance abuse related convictions. Sometimes people refuse what's called an implied consent refusal. If you refuse a breath test, you can lose your license. We have a lot of medical suspensions, eyesight, epilepsy, old age. Boy, do we get a lot of calls from those 80-year-olds who have lost their privilege to drive, like I mentioned, and they want some help. And then last but not least, you sometimes have the unsatisfactory driving, accidents, point accumulations. That's where we get the other end of the spectrum. A lot of 17 and 18-year-old kids or their parents calling us because Johnny or Jane have lost their privileges to drive. So most common is criminal convictions. I'm happy to talk about all of those ways that someone ends up either suspended or revoked in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Can we, first of all, though, what is the difference between suspended and revoked?
Really, really good question, because there's a huge difference. So a suspension is better. A suspension has a definitive ending point usually. So you're suspended for 6 months, you're suspended for 30 days. And all you typically have to do after the end of that period of time is pay what we call a reinstatement fee. Now, sometimes you see what's called an indefinite suspension. That's a little cloudier, but a suspension stinks, but it does not stink anywhere near as much as the dreaded R word, revocation. Revocation is the equivalent of a death penalty for your driver's license. It means you don't exist. It means you've been revoked and denied. You cannot even apply for a license until the Secretary of State of Michigan deems that you are eligible. And when I say apply, it's not going down to your local branch and asking for a license. You have to go through what is essentially a revocation appeal hearing, which is what we do day in and day out. And so if someone is revoked, they're told you can't apply for X amount of time, typically a year or longer. And even then, most people are without their licenses for longer than that because they're denied or they're not successful at their revocation appeal hearing. So major difference between suspension and revocation. The death penalty that is revocation is what fills up most of our time at the Geherin Law Group.
So what typically would lead you to a suspension? What typically would lead you to a revocation?
So revocation is typically multiple drinking and driving offenses or multiple felony driving offenses or a significant injury or death. So if you've never been in trouble with the law before, you have a couple beers too many and you hit and kill a pedestrian, your license in Michigan is going to be revoked. Whereas if you are having a couple beers too many, you get pulled over and get a first offense garden variety drunk driving, you're going to be suspended for 30 days. So major difference based on the outcome of the offense or the number of priors a person has. So revocation or death penalty, serious criminal offenses, repeat criminal offenses are the norm. Everything else I mentioned, unsatisfactory driving, medical or point accumulation, even in implied consent or refusals, are typically suspensions. Now, they can be dealt with in court. There are some options for people who are suspended, and we certainly are happy to talk about that with clients, but the grand majority of people who need our assistance are revoked because of one of those serious criminal or repeat drunk driving offenses.
You mentioned the refusal of chemical tests. It's always a hot topic. Do you take the breathalyzer? Do you not take the breathalyzer? Where do you land on that?
Yeah, that's probably the question I get most from old high school buddies or people calling my cell at 3:00 in the morning. Generally, attorneys won't weigh in on that answer. I can't say take it or not because there is liability for that decision. I would say to someone in casual conversation that most times refusing is going to put you in a worse position. Why? Because in the state of Michigan, they're just going to get a warrant for your blood anyway, and then you're going to be suspended on top of all the other penalties coming your way. Now, it might buy you some time. So I would say if someone has had those 2 beers or 3 beers, they know they're around the legal limit. Maybe a refusal buys them an extra hour and then they're under the legal limit and they have successfully avoided a drunk driving conviction, but they're still suspended. So give and take. I generally don't answer that question, but casually, I would say a refusal often has more harm than good.
So even if you refuse just on the grounds of saying like, I don't believe in this doesn't jive with how I think the world should work, and then you go and you get the blood test and you're under the limit, you're still suspended for 30 days.
Still suspended for a year. Great. Everything was right till the very end. And if it's your second refusal, which is pretty rare, then it's 2 years. But in Michigan, a first offense refusal, regardless of your reason, is 1 year suspension. Now, there are some hardships and things that you can apply for, which I can address later, but it's a 1 year suspension, 6 points on your record, irrespective of what your blood alcohol level comes back at or whether you're charged with a criminal offense.
That's so interesting to me. So it's basically like just saying, hey, don't get on your high horse and your soapbox. We're not going to let you do that, sort of a thing.
That's exactly right. Now, there are some definable, reasonable refusals. Sometimes there are religious things or health things. If someone has diabetes or hemophilia or other issues, they can't refuse. And so they could say, look, I'm not going to refuse. I'm not trying to be difficult here. Or if there's coercion or force by the police officers, that can say, I'm not consenting to anything. Outside of those unique circumstances, generally speaking, there's no real basis or allowable basis for you to refuse in Michigan.
Wow. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so can you kind of talk about a revocation appeal following a DUI conviction?
I can, because as I said, we've been doing those for 25 years. And boy, it would probably sound wrong when I say it, probably can do those in our sleep, not to minimize the importance of them. But when someone's been revoked, typically because of drunk driving offenses or repeat drunk driving offenses, they go through a process that is basically a sobriety hearing. In Michigan, it's called Rule 13. It's at the OHAO, all these acronyms. It's essentially a division of the Secretary of State. They have lawyers that work for the Secretary of State called administrative law judges. There are 10 of them sprinkled throughout our state. They determine whether someone has met his or her burden to return the license. And to get a hearing, you have to submit a lot of paperwork. There's what's called a substance abuse evaluation, a toxicology screen. You must get notarized letters from friends and family saying that you're totally sober. You have to fill out various forms, and that just gets you in the door. Then you're grilled by a hearing judge, a lawyer judge, at a hearing in which you're under oath and you're answering lots of questions about the legitimacy of your sobriety and whether you're a risk. And the grand majority of people lose those. They used to publish statistics, Kevin, and it was like 30% success at the first hearing. They stopped publishing. So I hear horror stories every day, people who go in there and have lost and lost and lost for several years until they retain an attorney like us, because generally speaking, we're going to know what their problems have been. We're going to know how to remedy those. We're going to get clients ready and sort of equal the playing field with a hearing judge who's reluctant to grant them relief. So in a nutshell, it is a full-blown hearing, administrative in nature at the Secretary of State, a fairly high burden, but it is all about sobriety, not need, and they are tough to win.
What is the timing on those? How soon can you go through that appeals process? And if you are denied, how soon can you try it again?
Really good question. So they'll give you an eligibility date. Typically, it's a year after your conviction, and then you can apply right at that time period. It takes about 6 weeks to get a hearing. And then once there's a hearing, typically there's a 2 to 3 week waiting period for what's called the deciding order. That order either granting privileges or denying. If they're denied, they typically have to wait 1 calendar year to try again. Otherwise, the Secretary of State would be inundated with people coming back all the time. But there are some avenues to go to circuit court, your circuit court of residency. So if someone lives here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they would go to the Washtenaw County Circuit Court and ask a judge, to override the administrative law judge at the Secretary of State. That happens pretty frequently, and judges sometimes want to get involved and sometimes don't. But in a nutshell, it's if you lose, you generally wait another year.
Another year. Okay. Got it. And so what other relief is available for someone who loses their privilege to drive? You mentioned the appeals court and circuit court appeals. What other options do people have?
Generally, that's it. Common calls we get every day is someone reads online about what's called a hardship appeal. I want a hardship license. I say, I bet you do, because we all need our licenses and it is a hardship to drive, but that's sort of a misleading thing. And a hardship license is generally limited to someone who has refused a breath test and needs a work privilege. I talked about that way around the 1 year if you refuse. Outside of that, there are not many avenues for hardship relief. So you are relegated to a legal appeal to say, hey, judge in a black robe, the administrative law judge made a mistake, a legal error, or was just biased or completely wrong on my case, please review. And then a judge gets involved and can override the Secretary of State and give a full license. They can send it back to the Secretary of State sooner for another hearing. We do a lot of circuit court appeals because sometimes the Secretary of State gets these wrong and is truly biased against someone. So generally speaking, your relief is limited to circuit court in your county of residence and on rare occasions, a hardship application.
What is the appeals process like for other things other than DUIs when people lose their license? Is it similar or are they different?
Outstanding question. Generally, if someone loses their license for, say, criminal offenses unrelated to drinking and driving, the only element or requirement is that they must prove they are no longer a danger to reoffend. So if you have someone out there who has committed to what we call flee and elude, where you're trying to run away from police, dangerous by its very act, they're going to be revoked. Their only element is to come in and prove I'm not a danger to do that anymore, either through growth, maturity, change in atmosphere, things like that. That's a pretty rare type of hearing, but that's one answer to your question. And then as for those medical or unsatisfactory drivers, if they're suspended or revoked, generally they have to go through what's called a re-examination where they prove to the state they're safe. They might have to do a driving test, an eyesight test. Older people often have to have cognitive tests, and that will get them back on the road. So those are the two unique things outside of the drunk driving revocations you asked about.
You talked about the older people that might get their license suspended or revoked. What usually is the cause of that? Do they do something on the road that they get pulled over for and the officer's like, I don't know if this person should be behind the wheel? How does that usually unfold?
Shockingly, and I may be there myself, I've got two very healthy, vibrant parents in their early 80s who both drive. But for a lot of parents, when they become a risk, it's the kids or the neighbors that call the police or call the Secretary of State. It happens so often. And there is an anonymous way to do that. And so oftentimes someone will get a letter in the mail saying, we'd like you to come in for a re-examination. And they don't know who, for lack of a better word, ratted them out. And so family members are almost always involved. Now, to answer your question, yeah, sometimes you have elderly people involved in an accident. Police officers are trained to recognize there may be some cognitive or physical issues at play and to err on the side of caution. They will report those drivers to the Secretary of State. And then it's up to the driver to convince the state that they are not a risk, that they have their faculties, that they don't have the problems that may have been apparent to a police officer or to family. And if they lose it, there's very little paths available to get their privileges back.
Which I suppose it's a bummer for them. But yeah, if it's because of age, if it's because of just, decline in different ways, whether it's physical or mental, hard to like fix that, if you will, for lack of a better term.
There's no doubt. All of us are out there on the roadway, and if someone is a danger, they don't belong driving, which frankly, I want to be clear, there are cases we turn down for that reason, either because someone's not truly sober or someone is a true risk, and that's not something that we're interested in entering the battlefield for.
Yeah, you want to help people, but you also don't want to put everybody else at risk by letting these or helping these people get back on the road.
You're exactly right.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So, you're a licensed attorney for this, obviously, or you're an experienced attorney for this. If someone has lost their license, do they need an attorney, or is it something that they can handle on their own if the circumstances are right? How do you generally coach people on that? Yeah,
there's no doubt about it. They need a licensed appeals attorney. And of course, I'm going to sound biased, but I am. Sure. But the reality, the statistics don't lie. And we started this podcast talking about the need for a license and how important it is. And for people who have lost it, going it alone is often a losing battle, and the money that they'll spend for a licensed appeals attorney is worth its weight in gold. Just think about a loss of salary for a year or a month, and what an attorney can benefit you to just know the process, know what to do and what not to do. It is a foolish mistake, in my view, to go in and face a seasoned, grizzled, angry hearing judge that doesn't want to give people licenses without an attorney. You're just setting yourself up for failure. The only equivalent is walking in to talk to a police officer or detective without an attorney. Both are huge mistakes, but jokes aside, anyone who has lost their license, been revoked, there is zero doubt they could benefit from a licensed appeals specialist like us.
What happens if someone who's had their license suspended or revoked gets in trouble for driving?
Yeah, so we have this, what we call mandatory like period. In plain English, they add the entire period of revocation on top of it. So if you're revoked for 3 years and you get caught driving, you got another 3 years on top of it, and it keeps stacking up, which is why we'll get clients calling us saying, I'm not eligible until, June of 2029. And unfortunately, they've made that bed. And every time they get caught driving, they get added time to it. And that's Michigan's way of saying, do not drive until we tell you are licensed to do so.
Yeah, interesting. Because you see sometimes, like, if you're looking at police blotter articles or stuff, oh, this person got into an accident or drunk driving where they were driving on a suspended license. That's something you hear a lot. That's really interesting. That's quite the harsh punishment, but you kind of have to understand it at the same time.
Yeah, you're right. And actually, Michigan has passed a series of laws in the last 15 years. If you're suspended or revoked and you hit someone, hurt someone, kill someone, the penalties are more significant than had your license been valid, again, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to Michigan Justice Chronicles with board-certified criminal trial attorney Dan Geherin. To connect with Dan, head to glgmichigan.com and be sure to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Dan, it's always great chatting with you. Thanks so much for all the insight.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.